Chapter 1. What is a knife? The fact is that there are all kinds of different knives that you can get and that you are going to use for different applications in a kitchen. A knife, in its basic sense, is a blade with a handle. The blade can be sharpened and honed to a very fine chisel point, and a good knife should tomato test. You take a tomato, and if you draw it across the tomato and it doesn't push the skin in, but it actually cuts the skin, that's a nice sharp knife. How do you sharpen a knife? Well, I'm not going to really go over that. I'm sure that there are plenty of knife sharpening videos out there on YouTube that you can use. For instance, for woodsmen and hunting people and stuff like that, hunters will show you probably better than I could how to sharpen a knife. But you can get like one of these little gizmos, which my daughter got me one year, and this will do a nice quickie sharpening. But you are going to want to get yourself a nice sharpening stone. If you have good cutware, good knives, and you want to sharpen them that way, put some oil on it and then sharpen them. Do that once a year, once every 6 months, depending how often you use your knives and what you use them for. So you can get a little gadgets like that. Honing a knife this is not sharpening. Many people confuse that. Sharpening actually bevels the point to the point. As you use a knife, it gets the little burrs this way, that way, and it bends the blade in a microscopic manner. And what the honer does is that it removes some of those burrs and realigns the knife, but it really doesn't sharpen it. So you should hone your knife just about every time that you use it. You basically do that by holding it at roughly a 30 degree, 20 degree, 30 degree angle, the angle of the blade, and then draw it towards you across the honer. You'll see these, I don't know if you can get in close enough to see the little lines that are in the honer, and that realigns the blade, and you go forward and backward, and then you go on top, on bottom, on top, on bottom. And you do that 3 or 4 times. You want to be sure never to go past this. This is the guard that guards your hand, so that you don't end up cutting your hand. But be sure not to draw all the way down, because 1, you're going to run your blade against this, and that's going to dull your blade, and 2, you risk cutting your hand. So keep it in the top half of the honer and draw it across like that. It takes a little practice, but work on it. Practice with an old bad knife first, so in case you accidentally mess it up, you don't ruin a very good knife. But as you get better at it, hone your knives just about every time you use them, at least every other time that you use them. So that's the honer. And now, let's go to what do I do to care for my knives. You can get a knife block like this. You don't want to put a nice sharp knife in a drawer just open like this, okay? Because what you're going to end up doing, it's going to bump into other things that are in that drawer, and it's going to damage the blade. And then you end up drastically reducing the life of your knife. If you have to put it into a drawer, you can get things like this, like blade covers that will cover the blade so that it at least gives it some protection while in the drawer, so it doesn't get bent or damage the blade. Also, you don't want to be pulling something out and accidentally cutting yourself. So find some way to keep your knife guarded. A knife block like this will do. They have magnetic things you can put on the wall that will hold knives. So, but just really do not just put them in a drawer. Butter knives, fine. They don't really have much of a blade, but nice, good cutting knives, you're going to want to protect somehow. Okay. So what kind of different knives there are? Well, principally in terms of manufacture, there are 2 different kinds of knives, and that would be the drop forged knife and the stamped knife. Now, a dropped forged knife, you can see, is one long piece of metal embedded with the handle at the top. it is actually literally dropped into a mold while it's melted, and then it is, when it's cold, when it has solidified, it is brought to sharpened into a blade at the one end. So that's why it's called a drop forged. Most knives today are made of stainless steel. Some older knives you will find out there that are made of iron. The way you can tell the difference is that the iron will actually begin to rust. And the way you care for that is make sure you don't put it through the dishwasher. You have to actually hand wash an iron knife every time you use it, and then dry it off really well. If it does begin to get a little bit of rust, you can take just a little piece of steel wool and knock the rust off of it. But that's a principal problem that you chronically have with iron knives. Other than that, they're very good knives. Today, most of them are made of stainless steel so that they will not rust, and they can go through the dishwasher. So that is a drop forged knife, as opposed to this kind of knife, which you notice, which does the same thing, but this metal is not actually forged. This is cold stamped. There's a big sheet of thin metal, and there's a big machine that comes down and cuts out like 100 of them all at one time, and then they attach the handle. These knives, this is principally a cheaper method of producing a knife, but that doesn't mean that you don't necessarily have a use for it. For instance, this particular knife is very handy. It's called a fillet knife, and you notice how it bends. See, a drop forged knife is not going to bend nearly as easily. It's a very rigid knife. This knife is specifically designed, very small, very thin, to go under meat in between bones. So when you're filleting, for instance, a fish, you can get this down near the bones, and you can very carefully move it across, and it will actually bend to conform slightly to whatever it is you're cutting, whether you're cutting meat off of a piece of pork, off a pork shoulder, or whether you're cutting fish, however you are cutting your meat. That's what this specifically is for. And so the stamped knife is actually better for that application. So, you can never judge a knife by how much you spend for it. In fact, do not go out and spend hundreds of dollars. You can literally spend $1,000 on a knife. Professional chefs do this. But you're going to want to find out first what kind of knife actually works best for you. And so start with the cheapo ones and work your way up if you want to go that far, okay? But for most applications, the knife that you're going to get at Walmart will probably last you in your home kitchen for years to come, okay? So, so in other words, don't necessarily go out and buy the biggest, most expensive knife set that you can find. If you can only get one knife, the one that I recommend that you get is that one. This is a European chef's knife. Now, there are variations on this. For instance, the Japanese have one that it's basically almost the same shape, so it comes out straight, and then there is it cuts on a sharp angle this way. So sometimes you'll see that where it's cut that way. That is a Japanese chef knife or an Asian chef knife. But this is a European chef knife. It is the most used knife in the kitchen. You can use this for almost anything that you do in the kitchen. These other knives are for special applications in different ways, but you can do almost everything that these will do with this knife. So if you are starting to buy knives and you can only afford one at a time, this is the one that you want. You want a knife that is well balanced so that when you hold it in your hand, it doesn't feel like it's going to tip this way or it's going to tip that way. That you can comfortably grip the handle. However, there are different shapes of handles that people have. There's this one. This is also a chef's knife. You notice that it has these holes in it. The holes are nominally to keep it from sticking to your food. It allows air to get behind the knife and allows, if you're carving something, it doesn't stick to it. Again, not a necessary feature. Nifty if you can get one that way. But what you want is a knife that is the right weight for you. Some people have smaller hands and don't have, super, we're not all Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, other knives are heavier, and people like the heft of a knife. And some people like a lighter knife. This is a lighter knife. This is a heavier knife. I prefer this knife, and this is the knife that I use the most. So, but it's comfortable in my hand. It's comfortable when I use it, and so that is what you are looking for, a knife that works for you. So I said, start with cheap ones and find out what works for you before you go out and spend a whole bunch of money. So European chef knife the universal knife will do almost anything for you. This knife is a carving knife. This is specifically for carving meat. While you can do it with this, as I've just talked about, this wide blade will stick to the meat. It gives it the meat will stick to the surface. This is thinner, so it has less of that. As the meat comes up, air begins to get behind it, and it will drop off. Not to say that things won't stick to it, things will, but much less so than with this knife. So this is for carving your turkeys and your roast beef, etc. This is a table knife. This is a steak knife for cutting meat. On an individual basis, you sometimes can grab this and use it when you're actually preparing the food, but principally this one goes on the table. What some people will mistake this, notice it comes to a very sharp point at the top. This is a paring knife, which is a little bit stubbier and has a shorter point than the steak knife does. And this is for prepping vegetables, principally. You can shave skins off, you can chop, do various things, principally with vegetables, and it's made so that you can work it like this, okay, as opposed to, again, you can do it with this. It's a lot. It takes a little bit of practice and know-how on how to do it, but having a nice, if I had to pick a second knife, it would be this one. Paring knife is very nice to have, particularly when you're doing vegetables. This is for murdering people. Yeah, when you want to make that sausage in the back, that homemade sausage. No. Mother, the blood. No. This is for principally chopping large cuts of meat. Okay, this is a butcher's knife, and it is for cutting through bone and cutting through very thick material. That's why you've got this really thick, wide blade. You want to have a lot of heft behind it, because if not, you'll snap. Okay, the knife will actually break. If you tried, chopping with this, you're gonna break this knife right off. Okay, and that's why you get this big wide knife if you're going to be butchering large chunks of meat. For instance, if you go deer hunting and you catch yourself a deer, you're going to need one of these to chop in between on the joints. That's principally where you use this. You can also use this in the kitchen, for instance, when you're Frenching chicken legs, what's called Frenching. You chop the end of the chicken drumstick off and then bunch the meat down into a little ball. It's called Frenching, and you would use this for that purpose. We already went over what the fillet knife does. Then there's a variety of different serrated blades. Now, serrated blades are going to, if you use them particularly like on raw meat, you're going to tear the fibers with this blade. The idea behind a serrated knife is that it's not just one long blade. You have a series of small blades, like a saw, that's actually going to saw through whatever you're preparing. Okay, so you're going to want to use this in places where if you used, again, you could use this, but you got to be very careful, and it had better be very sharp. For instance, if you're going to cut bread, because bread will just squish down, and you're going to end up with, squished bread, and you don't necessarily want that. Now, if the knife is sharp enough, you can do that, okay? But a serrated knife is basically a sawing mechanism where you can saw through, and you use this, for instance, is a bread knife. I don't know if you can get very close in on there, and you can see there's very tiny little teeth all the way up and down this blade, and so that you have, instead of one long blade trying to cut into a series of little blades that will cut as you're going, and that is what this is used for. This is a bread knife, long for being able to cut across a loaf of bread, and with the tiny little serrations. You cannot sharpen this knife. Okay? If it gets dull, you basically have to go get a new knife. That's why you either want to spend the money and get a hugely expensive but very good bread knife, or as I did here, this is a stamped out cheapo little bread knife, and when it gets dull, I just chuck it in the trash and get a new one. They're not that expensive if you go that way. So bread knife, and it depends on how often you make homemade bread and how often you have to cut it. You can go with an expensive or more expensive blade. This is a Cutco knife from a very good knife company. If this blade gets dull, they will actually you send it to the factory and they will resharpen it for you. It's a special blade. I think you might be able to see this one. That's a Copper Chef one. I don't know what happened to my other Cutco one. Anyway, it's actually a special kind of serrated blade that is not supposed to get dull, but they do. But you send it to the factory in order to be sharpened, because you really can't sharpen serrated blades yourself. So that principally covers the major areas of different kinds of knives, how to care for them, and what you're looking for in a good knife. It should be comfortable in your hand. It should do the job and hold a blade well. And you want to choose one for specific applications. As you get past the chef's knife stage, you are going to want to, go into the various applications. First, if you don't make a lot of homemade bread, you're not going to need one of these, so don't bother buying it. But if you're doing a lot of fishing, you are going to want one of these. So get the knives that you need for your kitchen and what you're making. And that is what a knife is.